this Friday webinar series. Both of you are coming on our webinar for the first time. So the brief introduction, we are a think tank about 5 years old in the NCR area. We positioned ourselves as a research-based policy think tank, and we have been working very closely with all parts of the government. We have been working with NITI Aayog, with the ministry, and we have also been working with UNSCAP for some studies and other think tanks. As a research-based policy think tank, it was obvious that G20 would interest us. And therefore, under the G20, we were fortunate that under the T5 International Economic Order, we did a couple of lectures, about 11 of them. And it was during that G20 interest, we realized that the issue of female labor force participation and gender issues and empowering women is extremely important. During this journey that we had in the last 5 years, in the last 3 years, this is about the 190th webinar that we are conducting. We realized that there are many issues pertaining to female labor force participation in our country, which needs to be stressed. So we are now running this series where we are inviting you to speak on these issues. During this phase of webinars, as COVID hit us, we realized also that if we want to contribute in policymaking space, research immediately may not be possible, but we could always bring in the best minds from across the world on contemporary issues that interest India, issues that are contemporary, may not immediately interest India, but are important. We've been very fortunate. We have had 2 Nobel laureates come and speak to us. We have had a great blend of 50-50. We have had foreign scholars and researchers coming and talking to us. And of course, we have had Indian scholars and researchers presenting their research for us. In today's webinar, we are extremely fortunate that we have Professor Seema speaking to us from Princeton, who was my colleague for a short time at Harvard while I was doing my postdoctorate. She was finishing her PhD, and we overlapped for a little time. And then to chair the session, as I haven't worked on gender issues, to chair the session, we are very fortunate to have Professor Gita Sen chair. And Professor Gita Sen actually needs no introduction. She is known to all of us, and she is so scholarly. And with her experience all across the world, she is known for her research. But I'll be very brief in my introduction, therefore. She is Professor Emeritus at the Institute of Management, Bangalore. And of course, I know her from my CDS days in Trivandrum. And then she moved from there to IIM Bangalore. She's also the former director of Ramalinga Swamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health at the Public Health Foundation of India, and on the Executive Committee of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAWN. Our key research areas are health and population, gender and development, and inequality. She was the first chairperson of the World Bank's External Gender Consultative Group and was a member on the Millennium Project's Task Force on Gender Equality. She has worked with the United Nations in several capacities, including as the lead consultant for the United Nations Population Fund's India Population Assessment. For me personally, I feel so privileged to invite Madam to chair the session today. Madam, please.
Thank you very much for that extremely, I might almost say, overly kind introduction, Charan. It's quite remarkable what you've been able to do with this webinar series in a very short time. I'm certainly very much looking forward to hearing what Seema has to say, given how short our time is. But I just thought I would make a couple of remarks briefly to set the frame within which I think, or which gives meaning and importance to what I expect she will be focusing on. Now, in the field of work on gender, gender power, women's studies, whatever you want to call it, work in India pretty much can be dated back to the 1970s, where there was a major role played by the report called Towards Equality, which came out in the 1970s. It was chaired by none other than Ela Bhatt, the founder of SEVA, and had a lot of the movers and shakers of work on gender equality on it. That report was a catalyst, not only to marshal facts and data, but to bring out the lives of women workers through their own stories, to open up public debate on laws, on policies and programs, and to place all of this within the social context. And I remember well the second conference of the Indian Association of Women's Studies. It was a very new association at that time, held in 1984 in Trivandrum. And the hallways were buzzing with new research, new findings on the lives and livelihoods of women as informal workers, street sellers, cart pullers, push cart vendors, home-based agarbatti, beedi papad rollers, you name it, unpaid or lowly paid agricultural laborers, factory workers, fish workers, health workers. And in all of this, what was very striking was that the official figures on female labor force participation tended to be so low. And yet, every time we looked, we never saw a woman sitting leisurely doing nothing. Women are always working. And I think the field since those days has worked hard to uncover, to examine, to value and analyze data and evidence, to understand the realities of women's lives and their experiences, to engage in public dialogues and discussions such as this one, and to place these in their social, historical, economic, and even political contexts. In doing this, I think the field has dug deep into the nature of power in order to understand the structural basis of gender power in laws, in economics, in the distribution of resources, in knowledge. How exactly does it work? The institutional nuts and bolts of how gender power works in our country. And very important for today's seminar, how is power cemented and reproduced through social norms, attitudes, and beliefs, and how is it enforced, often sadly, through threats, fear, and actual violence. So I think that today's seminar is an extremely important and valuable one, and I will not take too much more time, but we'll start by introducing our speaker for today. Seema Jayachandran is a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University. Her research focuses on environmental conservation, gender equality, health, and other microeconomic topics in developing countries. She serves on the board of directors of JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and leads JPAL's gender sector. She's also co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Program in Development Economics and co-editor of the American Economic Journal's Applied Economics. And in addition to that, she serves on the board of directors for CARE. Before joining Princeton, She was a faculty member at Northwestern University and at my own alma mater, Stanford University. She earned a PhD in economics from Harvard, a master's degree in philosophy and physics from the University of Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from MIT. So we have a speaker with an incredible range of training, knowledge, and it's with great interest we look forward. Over to you, Seema.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sen, for that generous introduction, as generous as Charan's was. And thanks very much for this opportunity to participate in this webinar that really is such a success story for starting from scratch and really going strong even through the pandemic. So let me go ahead and share my slides. So I'm not a WebEx expert, but hopefully you can now see my slides. Is that correct? Can someone
yes,
just
visible.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and I think then we'll open it up for questions if that's the format. So I'm going to talk about a project.
Seema, I think, am I only seeing that customize your stage view, or can everyone see the slides clearly?
Yes, they are clearly visible.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, let me go back to full screen. So yeah, so right now I think on my screen I see my title page, which says Reshaping Gender Attitudes in India Through Schools, an 8-year follow-up study. So this is a project that I guess we began over a decade ago. It's with Diva Dar, who at the time was at JPAL in Delhi and is now at the Gates Foundation, and Tarun Jain, who at the time was at ISB and is now at IIM Ahmedabad. And what I'm going to talk about is, this project, both what we did initially that's published and then some new results on a long run follow-up of our sample. So Dr. Sen set the stage, better than I can, but let me kind of say where this project kind of fits into this long 50-year history of studying gender in India. I think in many ways, we could have an optimistic view of the march towards gender equality. We generally see that over time, even without explicit policies trying to improve gender equality, you see progress. And part of that is just economic forces. Jobs start to require brains rather than physical strength, and that advantages women. But that doesn't mean we couldn't have policy intervention to speed things up. But I think my work on this topic in India has focused on areas of gender metrics where the gaps are not improving, even as India has grown, that they're persistent, or in fact, they're worsening over time. Two examples in India that I think probably everyone is aware of the statistics. One is the skewed sex ratio. If you take the 40-year view, the sex ratio has become more male skewed over time, and female employment, at least outside of the home, has fallen. So just in terms of the levels now, the overall male-female ratio at birth is somewhere around 1.1. And in some states, especially in North India, like Haryana, where this project is based, it's even higher, 1.2. And female labor force participation, 23%, 24% is the official number, I think. And those are the levels. The trends have worsened, not necessarily because the cultural norms or attitudes or beliefs have gotten worse, but just in the way they've interacted with some of the changes in the economy. I think in both of these cases, there are some attitudes people hold about the roles of boys versus girls or men versus women that contribute to these ways in which India is different from other countries with a similar economic structure. One is a view that sons bring status to the family. He's going to take care of you in old age. He's going to play roles in your funeral rites in Hinduism. And so, you want a son, and now with new technology, being able to have an ultrasound people wanting fewer kids, so that if you want to have one son, you used to be having 4 kids, now you want to have 2 kids, the chance that you have a son naturally has fallen. So that's a case where that status of a son has stayed fixed, but then access to technology, desired family size have clashed with it to make the sex ratio worse. I think there are different reasons. You might think India has lower female employment than other countries. People have different views on this. I think, some sense of sort of protecting women's purity or excluding them from interacting with men outside of their family, either in a commute to work or in a workplace, has reduced female employment and also, concentrated it in home-based work. Okay, so, luckily, go ahead. Is there a question? Coming to the political sphere, or, how politics comes into this, government, the civil society can try to solve some of these problems, but ultimately a lot of improvements have to come through government. And luckily, a lot of government officials would like to make the sex ratio less male skewed. They'd like to increase female employment. They might be motivated by human rights arguments, beliefs, or just practical ones. You don't want a lot of men who are struggling to find a wife. You have all this talent and human capital in India could be increased GDP per capita if women had more freedom to work outside in any job they wanted. And on each of these dimensions, and these are just 2 aspects of gender equality, there are many more, but, the government has tried many policies with varying success. And the way this project started was because the government of Haryana was interested in tweaking the financial incentives they had in place to have daughters. So they're trying to enforce the ban on sex-selective abortion, and then they have schemes that, a scheme that gives families some transfers in the daughter's name if they have daughters and then get sterilized. And so the way this project started was some officials in the government of Haryana started a conversation with Jaypal in India, and I was part of that conversation about, hey, can you help us evaluate and change these financial incentives? So I have, beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today, I have mixed views, or maybe not so great views, on those financial incentives as a strategy for this problem. So we counter-propose, will you let us do a pilot project trying something different, which is, getting to the root of these beliefs and attitudes and norms that have caused some of these problems, like the skewed sex ratio, to perpetuate and get worse in India. And in particular, we proposed using schools to try to change gender attitudes. You could try to change gender attitudes in many ways, focusing on adults or kids, using media, but schools seemed valuable, because kids are at an age where they are still forming their views and attitudes, so they're more malleable, and you can influence them. And in many ways, if a government wants to change the values in the society, for good or bad, the schools are a very powerful platform because there's such high school enrollment and you're reaching everybody to kind of shape the next generation. And so I think we all agreed this was a way to use schools for that purpose in a valuable way, promoting equality. So we started this project in 2013, and we aimed to do long run follow-ups. And so what I'm going to end with today is one of these long run follow-ups, conducted, I guess, 8.5 years after we started the project. And so the hypothesis is that this is going to be an addition to the secondary school curriculum during the regular school day, where there's going to be part of the curriculum on gender equality, where it's not going to be lectures with the teacher giving, speaking to the students. It was designed to be thought-provoking and discussion-based, where the hypothesis that was that if adolescents spent time thinking about the gender gaps in their among kids, among adults, that they see in their village or town, and they think about and with help from the teacher facilitator, think about and hear about the human rights arguments for equality, as well as the practical or economic arguments for equality, or sort of leaving money on the table, that on average, that will make them more progressive, make them think equality is important, and that will change what they believe, and that will in turn change their behavior. So we didn't do this, India-wide or Haryana-wide. So in terms of changing the entire norm in the community, this study wasn't designed to do that. It was designed to change the participants' attitudes, but you can think of this, if you scale this up in a more intense way, then the entire norm in the community might change. And so it was focused on both boys and girls in government secondary schools. They were in the program from grade 7 to 10. So it was 2.5 years. So they started out the cohorts that were in class 7 and 8, and then they continued for 2.5 years. And it was the NGO that designed and ran this program. They would teach classes for about 45 minutes every 3 weeks over these 2.5 school years. So we published in 2022 a study that examined the immediate impacts, like 3 months after students had finished this 2.5 year curriculum. And we had another follow-up survey, which was 2.5 years after it ended. So to see whether things persisted, the changes persisted. And today I'm going to show you, what I'm calling the 8-year effect. So 8.5 years after the program started, or 5 years after the participants had no more interaction with Breakthrough or no more of these classes. So at the time of the 8-year follow-up, the sample is about 20 years old. And the reason, the strategy of working with kids, on the one hand, they're more malleable, but for some of the outcomes we care about, they don't have a lot of power yet. So it's, the theory of change here is that you change kids' attitudes. They can make some changes in their behavior when they're young, but really what you're banking on is that when they become adults, they have autonomy, that they'll start to make changes. In many ways, it's still a little bit too early to see these changes. For the boys who are in the program, my expectation or my hope is that when they get married, they will be more supportive of their wife having a career. Most of the young men in our sample, at age 20 are not married. So what we're going to focus on is mostly women's outcomes, because women get married earlier than men. And for some outcomes, we only have hypotheses about women. So women's education, their employment, their age of marriage. Not everyone is married, but did they get married by age 18 or 19? For both boys and girls, or they're now young men and women, their gender attitudes, and then women's sense of personal autonomy. And for this most recent survey, we also looked at spillovers to other family members. So did you influence the attitudes of your younger sibling who wasn't part of the curriculum, didn't get the curriculum, but they might have learned it at home? And we look at whether you influence your parents. So because when we started this project, I think in my head, I thought of the parents as, the bad guys, the ones who had these conservative gender attitudes. And that's true on average. They do have conservative gender attitudes, but that, using schools, you could do an end run around them. I think what we learned anecdotally is that kids would talk to their parents about what they learned. And so that made us want to test this hypothesis. Maybe the parents became more progressive because their children, their teenagers, were influencing them. So I'm going to describe the intervention, recap the previous findings, and then talk about these 8-year impacts. Okay, so first, just to both give you a sense of the kinds of questions we're going to look at attitudes, and to tell you something you probably already know, which is attitudes are not very supportive of equality, even at a young age of 12 years old, which was the average age at the beginning of our study. So this is a standard question used worldwide in surveys, which is, do you think boys should get more opportunities and resources for education than girls? And we see in our sample that close to 80% of boys agree that boys should get more resources for education than girls. And half of girls agree with that too. And it's not that the other people say girls should get more. The other people, by and large, say it should be split equally. So, and this is a pattern we see across the board, and it shouldn't surprise you. Girls are more supportive of equality than boys are, but it's not a very high level of equality, or not what we would hope, where half of girls are accepting or believing it's right for boys to get more educational opportunities. And so the goal of the project is really to change these attitudes, to lower numbers like this, so more people think the right thing, the morally right thing to do, the practically right thing to do is to create equal opportunities for girls and women, to allow them to have the same opportunities that boys and men have. So the government of Haryana was interested in trying this pilot of let's use schools and try to promote equality. this was really like a proof of concept pilot. And so the way to make this work is they said, we don't have the expertise or won't have the bandwidth to go do this, change the curriculum ourselves. And we're not going to do that without some, sort of smaller scale pilot. And so we brought in Breakthrough, the NGO, into this partnership, and they played, the most critical role of designing this curriculum and in this pilot teaching it. So, the idea was never that at scale you would have the NGO leading these classes, but in the one-time pilot in 150 schools, their staff taught these classes. So it was 27 sessions over these 2.5 years. During this 45-minute hour, the Breakthrough teacher led the class. The regular government teacher could participate if they wanted. Most of them chose to take a break and, go into the courtyard of the school and have a break then. There were 27, the session topics varied. There were some on attitudes, some on aspirations, some on who does different work in the household and outside of the home. Some were about tolerance of discrimination by others. So not just how you behave, but, sort of being a active bystander. And then a few of the sessions were on communication skills, and this theme will come back, under the view that you can change people's attitudes so they believe in equality, but to actually change their behavior, you can't, especially for kids, but even adults, you have to influence other people. You have to tell your parents you don't want to get married at 17 or 18. You need to convince your husband that you should be allowed to work, or and so some of them were about trying to helping people translate their attitude change into behavior change. One of the nice approaches that Breakthrough did, which I'll come back to maybe at the end, is that I think is potentially a challenge for scaling it up or something to think about, is that they designed a very interactive program. So it wasn't, a lecture, it was training, hiring people who knew how to lead a discussion, get kids talking, get them debating. And so I think in that sense, one of the health education secretaries during this project was very worried that doing this was going to crowd out how well students did on other parts of the curriculum. Honestly, I think this was probably had some spillovers to students learning, because this skill of critical thinking, debating, articulating your views is just a very valuable skill that probably gets underemphasized in the Indian curriculum. It also meant that kids enjoyed this. So it wasn't, you might worry that, boys will check out during this. They actually seemed to be engaged. So, I'll just give you briefly one example of one of the sessions, which because I think for me, it's intuitive how this might make some people more progressive in their attitudes. There's a session on the division of household chores where the kids break out in groups and discuss who does various chores, and then they come back together and say who does the cooking and the laundry, etc. at home. And it won't surprise you that, in every household, it's the girls and the women, the mom and the daughters, who do those chores, and not the dad and the sons. And then the Breakthrough facilitator will ask, why is that? Why is there that gender division? Is it fair? And, sometimes a student will say, well, it's because women are better at those things. Men are better at other working outside the home. And then, a facilitator will say, well, if women are such great cooks, like, why aren't they the ones who are the cooks and chefs in restaurants? Maybe they would find it more satisfying to cook for weddings, and many people, the world would enjoy these talents if they're so great. Many more people could enjoy these talents. The woman could feel like she's fulfilling her talent. So both from a, sort of human rights capabilities point of view, and just from a, GDP per capita point of view, we're misallocating this talent. And so, it's a kind of thing where I think lots of kids have held these views without thinking hard about them, and being forced to, defend their positions, think harder about that. Not everyone's going to have an eye-opening moment, and there might be some people who have a backlash the other way. But, you can imagine lots of people kind of, as they have to think about it and defend it, they realize they don't have a great argument for inequality, or, what they thought of as the justification might not be a logically solid argument. Okay, let me skip that. So this was done in 4 districts in Haryana, reasonably close to New Delhi. And we did a randomized control trial. So the research study the fieldwork was done through JPAL's office in JPAL South Asia. We worked in 314 government secondary schools. Most of them were co-ed, some of them were single sex. We see similar results in the co-ed and the single sex schools. Breakthrough had funding to run the program in 150 schools. So we randomly chose 150 of these schools to be the treatment group where the intervention, the curriculum change happened. And then 164 of them didn't have the curriculum change, and they're our control group. And we collect data from students in all 314 schools. So we started with a baseline survey of students in 2013. The intervention ran for 2.5 years. We did a first end-line survey in late 2016, early 2017, another one a couple years after that. And those are the data we published already. And then we recently did a third end-line ending at the beginning of this year that I'll present. So the original study was big. We enrolled close to 15,000 students. That's maybe too many for these short run results. But if we eventually want to look at things like, were the wives of the boys in the program working? What's the composition of their children's and the sex composition of their children over time? We're going to expect smaller effects over time as you look at more downstream outcomes, and it's harder to track a sample. So we have a large sample where we more than 45 students in a school were participating in the intervention. All the kids in the school had this curriculum. If it was a treatment school, we, for our study, randomly sampled 45 students in those schools if their parents consented for them to participate and the child assented to participate. So they were about 12 years old at the beginning, and then they had the intervention from grade 7-8 through 9-10. Then we did the first end line when they were in grades 9-10, the second end line they were in grades 11 and 12, and then the third end line, which was 8.5 years after the start of the program, or 6 years after the intervention ended. This one is more challenging to have a resurvey rate, both because more time had passed. COVID, disrupted a lot of people's, some people moved or shifted, but also because, some of the girls, young women, had now married and moved. And so we had an 80% resurvey rate of the original participant. And then for many of the kind of hard outcomes, like is the participant married, we can ask the parent. We don't need to directly get that information from the participant. So for some of the outcomes, we have 91% of the data. Okay, so to recap the previous findings. So in these first and second end lines, we had 3 primary outcomes. The main one was attitudes. So I'm going to skip for this talk kind of how we try to address experimenter demand challenges, or, are people just telling us what they think they want to hear? I think we do a good job of ruling that out as what's driving the results. But, we just look, what do people believe is right and wrong, where we use mostly existing questions like the one I showed you about, should boys get more resources for education than girls? So this is relevant for both the boys and girls participating. The one outcome where we just focus on girls is their aspirations, their education goals. Do they want to have a career after marriage? And then the third outcome is behavior, where this is, the kids are young, so they don't have power to make decisions about, going to a private school rather than a government school. So we focused on behaviors that they have some control over, like the chores they do, or for girls, they're walking to school without alone and things like that. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. It's pretty simple. We have treatment and control. It's randomized. We could basically just show the raw means. We control for sort of baseline values, baseline outcomes, just to improve precision and, just to make sure nothing was unbalanced. The results aren't sensitive to that. So here's a recap of what we found at the first end line, sort of immediately afterwards, and then 2.5 years after that. So the way these are coded is in standard deviations. And my next slide is going to help a little bit with how do we want to think about the magnitudes. But everything is coded, so a higher value is more support for gender equality. And so what we see is in the first bar on the left is that attitudes on average for boys and girls pooled are 0.18 standard deviations more progressive. we don't see anything on girls' aspirations. And, in hindsight, we should have made, that this isn't surprising because girls' aspirations are pretty high. The vast majority of them say they want to have a career and work outside the home after marriage. Much higher than the data we see for what's actually true. And then in these behaviors that are related to supporting gender equality, we see an improvement as well. Maybe the first big surprise for me was that we see a lot of persistence. So 2.5 years later, when people hadn't been getting these messages through the classes, they still had these more progressive attitudes, and their stated behavior was in line with them. So on effect sizes, how do you want to think? Is 0.18 standard deviations big or small? So one benchmark I find useful is if we take our control group, girls are more progressive than boys. You have some intuition about how much girls support equality more than boys. That gap in this metric of the standard deviation of an index of 17 questions, that gap is 0.5 standard deviations. So, if a boy goes through this curriculum, he doesn't become as supportive of gender equality as a girl is, but it closes up over a third of that gap. Another way to think about the effect size is we can think of what researchers call a persuasion rate. So of the people, in the cases where someone originally was holding a conservative view, like we shouldn't have female politicians, or women shouldn't work outside the home, and what share of those cases was the view transformed to support for gender equality by the intervention? And it's 16%. So I think that's pretty big. I don't think any single intervention or policy is going to solve the problem of gender norms. And so, tackling a sixth of it is pretty good. And you can also imagine, extending this program so it's not just 2.5 school years, but it's naturalistically included in the curriculum for many more years. So this is now looking at the difference between boys and girls. And what we see on gender attitudes is both boys and girls become more supportive of gender equality. They start in different positions. Girls are more supportive than boys, but they both become more supportive than they were because of the intervention. For behavior, we see there's more behavior change for boys than girls. And that's, this wasn't, we didn't really think hard about, to expect this. We didn't know who was going to be more responsive to the program. But, given that both boys and girls changed their attitudes, I think it makes sense in hindsight that there was more behavior change for boys, because they have more power in society. So this is, it's almost like a sad fact of the power structure. But, if it takes not just believing it, your attitudes, but also the power, the lack of constraints to actually translate that into action, boys have more of that freedom and power. And so in that sense, it sort of is a reminder why you need to involve boys and men in these changes, because if you convert their attitudes, they have more power to act on it. In the second end line, we see not just this more behavior change for boys, but we also see more attitude change persistence for boys, which could be related. It could be, girls tried to act on their attitude change and they realized it wasn't successful and they faded back, whereas boys got some positive reinforcement. We can't know, but what we can see is that there's more persistence for boys than girls. And so at this point, I think combining these, if you had asked me, what do I think we'll see in the long run? I would say it's that when those boys get married, they're probably going to be more supportive of, helping out in domestic work at home, being supportive if their wife wants to work outside the home, etc. So we'll still need, 5 more years before that kind of effect we can test, just given age of marriage. Okay, so now pivoting to the 8-year follow-up. So let me just skip this in the interest of time and say, for the educational, for the primary outcomes, one thing we were excited about the long run outcomes is not just because these are the things, I think it matters what people believe in their heart of hearts. So if people kind of like, are less discriminatory, there are all sorts of small behaviors that they change that are probably good for society. But in terms of convincing governments to adopt this curriculum, I think it's much more influential if you see hard outcomes change, so metrics that a chief minister would care about, like the college going rate of women, the gross enrollment ratio, female employment rates, or early marriage rates. And so now that the sample are adults, you can start to see these outcomes, at least for the women. So we look at educational attainment. And what I'm going to show you, we code it up as 2 for some college, 1 for completed secondary school, and 0 if they didn't complete secondary school. The second one, which is, are they, economically active in some way? Are they either in higher education or are they employed? Where the other possibility is they're neither employed nor in any schooling or training. And then the third one, we look at age of marriage. And so, kind of disappointingly, but maybe not super surprisingly, we don't see any movement on these outcomes. We don't see an improvement in girls' educational attainment. Girls' educational attainment, including college going, is already quite high in this sample. The challenge is not starting college. It's probably either completing college, after marriage, and then education afterwards. Maybe the thing that I'm most surprised at or disappointed in is this is an indicator for what we're calling here engaged and productive activities. So half of the sample is either working, employed, or in school. And 45% of these 20-year-old women are not doing neither of those. They're sort of either married and taking care of their family, their home, or living with their parents and taking care of doing domestic work. We don't see any improvement in that. We also don't see any difference in being married at 19 or younger, or being ever married, where we control for age. So on these sort of hard outcomes for women, nothing seems to have changed. In terms of the attitude change, the gender attitudes, we see some persistence. It's faded over the 3 years since the last survey I reported on, but we still see people have more progressive attitudes. And this is looking separately for boys versus girls. And so this 0.11 is for the boys, and the sum is for the girls. And so we continue to see, insofar as there's still attitude change, it's mostly for the boys. One positive note here is that we see that the young women report having more personal autonomy. Things like, do they feel like they have control over their life? Do they have access to a mobile phone? Can they leave their home? So they were able to translate, their kind of wanting more freedom into getting more freedom over things that, aren't as major as the age at which they get married, but certain things that they value. And so, I think this idea of having more freedom in your life is something I think probably women value, but maybe is not as, it's not going to move the needle for policymakers as much. Okay, let me say, this is the spillovers to siblings. So we see siblings, I'll just be quicker right now. So we see that siblings, these younger siblings, have more progressive attitudes. And so, what do we have in mind here is that the boy or girl who is in this program, they have this younger sibling, they either act differently and they're a role model for their sibling, or they tell their younger sibling what they learned. But this is one way that, kind of interventions can have multiplier effects because people convert other people. When we look at the parents, we see that we don't see any change for mothers, but we do see changes for fathers. And if you look what's going on here, it's entirely when they had a son who was in the program. So you want to interpret this 0.3 effect as, if there was a boy who was in the program, what are his father's attitudes? They're much more progressive. If you sum these two together, that's the effect for the cases where it was a daughter who was in the program. She's not so influential to her father. So basically, like mother's attitudes, kids aren't influencing their mothers, but sons are able to make their fathers more progressive. And one of the things that's kind of we see is boys talk to their fathers about being more supportive of their older sisters' aspirations. And so another way that, you could see kind of the importance of men in these norm changes. Interestingly, we also see we were kind of curious whether this was an awakening of views on equality that extend beyond gender, because a lot of this was about, thinking about equality as being important per se. And so we asked some questions about, do you think it's okay for someone from a general caste to marry a scheduled caste? Do we think it's okay for a Muslim to marry a Hindu? For my taste, the means of this are very low, and the treatment effects aren't enormous in size, but we do see this movement towards people having kind of more progressive views on other aspects of equality. So let me talk about where we're going from here. We want to keep doing longer run follow-up surveys if we're able to track the sample and raise funds. We can maybe we'll see some changes in female participants' employment. I think this personal autonomy result is important to see if it persists. And as I mentioned a couple times, I think we're sort of keen to be able to track the sample to see what happens when the male participants gets married. And eventually you could look at the sex composition of their children. If you think back, what motivated the government of Haryana was the sex ratio. We're not going to ask them if they had a sex-selective abortion. You could just ask them, or ask their parents even, tell me about your grandkids, and back out whether the sex ratio is less skewed. And then the other track here is based on these promising initial results. JPAL South Asia and Breakthrough have been working with state governments to try to scale up the curriculum. So the government of Haryana there actually was not interested in scaling it up, but 2 states in India have scaled it up. So the government of Punjab and the government of Orissa have scaled this up, where instead of Breakthrough teaching it, it is Breakthrough training government teachers and government social studies teachers teaching the curriculum. So I think we're helping the governments monitor this. There's no like randomized control trial or about states are scaling it up. I think the challenge is, I don't think anybody expects the effects to be as large when you're doing it at scale with government teachers. But, I think we're trying to see, how much of the effects are moderated by how much the teacher themselves believes in gender equality, because Breakthrough recruited teachers who believe in equality. Social studies teachers, that's not a criterion for becoming a social studies teacher. And also, how dynamic they are, because it seems like, a key to this seems to have been the interactive nature and leading a discussion well. We're excited that this has had some traction. I find it hard to believe it could do harm. We're excited to see how much good it does in this scaled up government version. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Professor Jayachandran. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm just sorry that the length of time we have for the discussion is relatively short. I'm going to raise a few questions myself and then take some from the audience. And I certainly look forward to reading the papers. Let me just start out by saying something about what I know. I think good choice of NGO. Breakthrough's got a lot of experience, very good choice. So, because that was my first question, who were your intermediaries in doing this? Having said that, there's 2 or 3 questions I want to raise for you that come up in my mind, and undoubtedly you've thought about them or had them come up. One is, one of the important things we've learned from the work, for instance, of the MV Foundation on child labor is the importance of getting community buy-in. You can do anything with, you can talk till you're blue in the face with individuals about the importance of sending children to school rather than sending them to work. But unless you can get a kind of community agreement that this is what the community will go for, it doesn't happen. So that's the first question I have for you, whether there was, how much or whether there was any of that kind of input into this intervention, because to me it sounded very much like your classic RCT with individuals. And so that's question number 1. And I think that a lot of the change that the MV Foundation found was in fact through the feedback loops from the community back to the individuals. And we've seen that in a lot of other things. I won't get into that. Second question is some of these things that you're asking about are not, and looking at in terms of your 8-year follow-ups, particularly, are not just attitudinal, there are real barriers. And those real barriers, for instance, to work at a time when female employment has been plummeting, and not because girls or women don't want to work, it's because the jobs aren't there, is a real barrier that may in fact be masquerading. And so maybe your results aren't quite showing you what you might think they're doing. I would say the same thing a little bit about things like sibling effects, and I won't even talk about the religion caste issues, but sibling effects, one of the things that we know well is that parents tend to control the oldest girl much, much more than they control the later ones. That's true for boys as well, but especially true for girls. So sibling effects may in fact not be so much coming from the elder sibling, but from the fact that the parents have just gotten easier about the whole thing. And I guess my last question that I would, well, the second to last question is about the Hawthorne effect on these endline surveys. Yes, there wouldn't have been too much of a tendency to tell you what you wanted to hear in the initial period. But by the time you're doing the end lines and the follow-ups, these kids, and they're not kids, they're really growing up during this period, know very well what they should be believing and what they should be saying. And I think that's a big challenge for an attitudinal survey such as this one. Are they telling you? And that might account also for the big gap between the improvements in attitudes and the absence of real change in behavior that you said was really disappointing. Last, and this is just an informational question, were the questions and all about what girls should and should not be allowed to do? Or was it also about what boys should do and should not do? For instance, boys and men, should they share housework or not? And what about violence? Is violence okay? Because one of the most disheartening aspects of attitudinal data that we've had is the data that keeps coming from the National Family Health Surveys, the NFHS rounds, which consistently show that not just boys, not just boys and men, but girls and women believe that violence against girls and women is justified under a whole lot and, varying things, including such trivia as she doesn't cook well, to going all the way to she went out of the house without getting my permission, etc. But the persistence of the belief that violence is justified under those circumstances on an all India basis. So I'm just throwing you a bunch of
Yeah,
questions. Maybe
Let
you
me
want
tackle
to
these
take
before
around.
going to the
Right.
audience, because my
Yeah.
memory is yeah. So
Go ahead.
the first question you asked was about kind of starting from the community rather than kids, and so I think there's a lot of evidence that if you could do kind of like a multi-pronged and change everything, it will be more successful. And in fact, Breakthrough is doing some things where they're working with panchayats and young leaders. They're trying to work with parents. I think in this case, we were trying to evaluate something that was very scalable, very cheap. It doesn't require like more new boots on the ground, new staffing, but that, like a government could say like, look, we can change the curriculum. Like, Punjab has changed the curriculum to do that. And so, it's not necessarily, I don't think we expect it to be as transformational, certainly not in the short run, as if you kind of involve the communities, work with cup panchayats and panchayats, et cetera. But, to like actually be able to reach 1 million kids, and like without, hiring more people or budgetary allocations, like this seemed like an approach. So kind of, trying to think of something that is not solving all of the problem, but that was like really feasible to scale up. And then, as I said, Breakthrough's now trying a version where it's a much more expensive version, but where they also have parents involved in the curriculum, where they're saying, and so I think we all think that will be more successful. The question, I think, for a lot of policymakers is it enough of a increase in the effect to warrant the extra, budget? So I guess yeah, so that's on the kind of community where I guess I would say, we're thinking about not just what's most effective, but what's most cost effective or logistically feasible to scale up. In terms of the jobs aren't there, other constraints, I think, I completely agree with you. We might have taken, I think things like, early marriage, you might have thought, okay, that's maybe there are some ways that, if there was enough of a transformation of from the program that girls could remove that. But I honestly think this is why I keep coming back to, like, I think that we'll see more changes from the boys. You have to convince your parents. You might now think it's not fair that I have to get married at 18 when I want to continue in college, but you have to convince your father and your mother, and the intervention isn't miraculous in that way. And so but yeah, I think there are other attitudes is maybe necessary, but it's not sufficient to move all of these outcomes. In terms of the sibling effects, I completely agree that there's a difference in the older versus the younger. But what I was presenting was the differences between the cases where the older sibling participated in the intervention and these control schools. So it was, so above and beyond the fact that these younger siblings might have more freedom, we see that there was a bigger effect when their older sibling was in the program. And so, that could be because the older sibling convinced the parent to be more lenient, or they, talk to their younger sibling, but it does seem to be like an effect of the program. Yeah, and then in terms of Hawthorne effects, et cetera, that was something that's like a very big part of the research study and research design that I skipped because of the length here. But, I think that's always a concern when your main outcome is like what people believe, and so we do several things that I didn't, talk about, but I'll mention a couple here. One is we have some outcomes that are not just that are sort of like behaviors, that were objective behaviors. So for example, we had a petition where students could choose to sign a petition opposing the dowry system, wanting enforcement of bans on dowry. And for that petition, we published names in local newspapers and gave that list of the supporters to the local politicians. And so students knew this, and they chose whether to sign the petition. And we see in the people who are in the intervention were more likely to sign that. And that's a case where there's some cost. It's not just telling privately the surveyor this answer. The community's going to hear about it. That's going to be in the newspaper, etc. We also had one where we had a scholarship application to college where we had a scholarship to support fees, where girls who were in the program who had this curriculum were more likely to complete the scholarship application. So that again is like as a behavior, they had to spend time filling out this application, go and mail it in, and the idea there was if you were more keen on going to college, you had this higher aspiration, you were able to convince your parents you should go to college. So it was worthwhile for you to win a scholarship, you would do that. We have some, kind of behavior measures that are people have to spend some time or make public their views, and we see effects on that. We also do something that's a little bit hard to explain briefly, but social psychologists have a tool for measuring across people who's more likely to have these Hawthorne effects, like who gives these socially desirable answers. It's not perfect, but we have that measure. We put it on our baseline survey, and then we do analyses for the people who have a lot of propensity to give those socially desirable answers or have these Hawthorne effects, and then the people who psychologists would classify as having a less of a tendency to do that. And we still see these treatment effects for the people who have less of a tendency to do that. So that's another, kind of reassurance that this isn't all just Hawthorne effects or experimenter demand. And in terms of, we did ask about violence, at least on the last survey. That's a tricky one to ask about, just from a, when kids are too young, they didn't want to ask about it. We asked, so there is some, we don't see a decrease in reported incidents of, being groped or touched inappropriately by the girls. There's always a reporting challenge in things like this. But attitudes in those domains do improve. So hopefully I gave decent answers to all of that. And
thanks very much. I think, Charan, can I take one audience question? Do we have time or not really?
Actually, we have run out of time.
I know we've run out of time.
I also wanted to ask one question that was quick. Maybe you can ask the audience to tell their questions very briefly, and then Professor Seema can take a call if she wants to answer them, or just as
I think that's a bit unfair. If they might, I suggest that, I'm sorry, but Dr. Ramesh Chandra has had his hand up for quite some time, and there's another gentleman, I think. If you can just put your questions in the chat, and Dr. Seema will certainly see them. And there's some other questions in the chat as well that I think, Charan, you can pass on to.
If there's a way
Seema,
to get the chat transcript or something. Yeah.
because
right.
Seema has to
And then
teach.
she can
Seema
try
has to
and
start
respond
teaching in,
to
I think,
those.
5
Yeah,
minutes.
I have 5 minutes. So if you want to, if other people have commitments, you or
Okay,
Dr. Sun have
well,
commitments,
then
we can end. But if
why
I have
don't
time
you
for
ask-
5 minutes.
Why don't you ask your question, Charan?
My question was very simple, Seema, and my other issue is that I'll need 2-3 minutes to wind up because I have some announcements to make. And I know,
Yeah.
I know you have a class waiting to take you to listen to you. So I'll be very brief, Seema. So my quick question, and we will discuss it offline later, was that had you done this survey in a state like Bihar or Jharkhand, would you have anticipated a different set of results?
Yeah, I don't know. So tell me more about your hypothesis. What is your hypothesis?
My hypothesis
You think-
would have been, because in Punjab, we had a very similar situation 20 years ago. They came out with corrective measures and they improved the sex ratio. And I thought this, to some extent, probably this had to do with social norms and mores, but probably also had to do with something, is the availability of sex determination and sex termination equipment.
Yeah, so I would say that Haryana and Punjab have a worse sex ratio than other states, and I don't know that it's because there's more patriarchy or desire to have a son. It's really because they're wealthier states, than Bihar, elsewhere. So, that is important for two reasons. Like, you have to be able to afford a ultrasound and abortion services. So that costs money, just access and the expenses. And then the other is desired fertility, because, the sex ratio has gotten worse. Partly, some of my research is on this, people in Haryana and Punjab, like, especially those, districts near Delhi, like, nobody wants to have more than 2 kids. So if you were okay with, like, you have a girl, and then you have a third kid or a fourth kid to have a son, you adjust by having more kids, but if you really are in a kind of, sort of have had this demographic transition and want to have 2 kids, then you're going to choose sex selection. So, I guess I think that the attitudes are similar across the Hindi belt, and exactly which outcomes, other states, early child marriage is an issue, in Odisha, early child marriage is an issue in the way that it's not in these districts in Haryana. So, I think what you would emphasize, and in fact, when Breakthrough has been working with the governments to do the intervention in Punjab and in Odisha, it's been tailored, to the actual metrics or gaps that different states are worried about.
Problems, even if you allow, Charan sir, please, if you allow, then
I think,
can ask something very
I
important to
think we're
discuss.
going to have to close now. So I'll just very quickly thank our speaker for today. Thank you very much, Seema, and I certainly very much look forward to reading the papers. Over to you, Charan, for your closing remarks.
So thank you so much. Firstly, madam, it's always a privilege to listen to you. And I want to thank you for agreeing to chair the session. And Professor Seema, I was there at NCAR, and I always thought your research is so rigorous and so beautiful. That's why, because on our forum, we get people from across the country and even neighboring countries. I wanted to expose them in nooks and corner of our country to such good, high quality, rigorous research. And as Professor Sen mentioned in the beginning, your training is absolutely meticulous. And I thought your agreeing to come and speak to us was really a privilege and honor for us. I want to really thank you for that. The announcement I want to make is, as you have noticed, Seema's presentation is beautiful and rigorous, so you will have the recording available on our website tomorrow by noon Indian Standard Time. I'm sure many of you would like to revisit it and relook at the implications that it has. The final announcement I want to make is next week, same time, Friday, we have a discussion on multi-dimensional poverty in our country, and Yogesh Suri, who's from Niti Aayog, will be leading the discussion, and we'll have discussants too over there. The last point I quickly want to make is, you have heard about financial literacy. EGROW is making an attempt on economic literacy. So almost every evening, 7:30 to 8 p.m., 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. online, EGROW has some discussion or the other. The one which we are starting in a few days from now is on the Indian economy, and we are going to be discussing various issues on the Indian economy, one a day, with speakers who are either retired officials from the RBI, some of them from IIMs, some of them from SEBI, some serving in Delhi University and JNU. I would request each one of you, if you can spread the word. It's very nominally priced on a no cost and no profit basis, because we pay our speakers. So very nominally priced. If you want to spread economic literacy across the country, and I would prefer that far and wide in our country, an opportunity for them to listen to the best speakers on the subject. This is an attempt which EGROW is making. Let's take the most and the most benefit out of it. Once again, let me thank Professor Sen, Professor Seema, and the participants to make it such a rich discussion. Thank you.